in my roll. Kiss the boot of shiny, shiny leather, shiny leather, the dark. I'm not a woman, I'm not a man. I'm something you can't comprehend. I'm a threshold yearning to sing. You can feel it in the air. Breathe to the rhythm. Dance to the rhythm. Work the rhythm. Live to the rhythm. Love to the rhythm. Like the surge of the wave. Lead the naked island. Oh yes, I love you. Me either. Subtitle Why Madeleine, because I was thinking about the Proustian sensory jolt, the way when he eats that little Madeleine, if he remembers his childhood. And the same thing that whenever we come into a shop or a car, and then suddenly you hear a song, it often jolts you back to all sorts of things. Okay, and then you just have the names. So I let the credits go up just for the fact that this piece was created with about, well, 4 or 5 collaborators, and then the gallery team setting up this. So it was quite an extensive, a lot of people worked on facilitating this this project, and then of course the documentation for the video. I think that's what I have to, what I came with to talk to you about. So I just wanted to thank Johannes and Fiona for having invited me to come and talk to you today. So I hope you found it interesting. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Sometimes I sit here to moderate. Fiona, why don't you join your guest, and then you can moderate a little bit the discussion. Yeah. And I'll try and bring up some more lights.
Does anyone have something to ask Caroline or comment?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. If it was influenced by the Scandinavian, coming across, but how much knowledge do we actually have that that's how it was pronounced?
Oh.
Or is it your interpretation?
Yes, it really is my interpretation. I've been speaking to a medievalist who's very interested in this performance of basically a dead language, and how do you know and how do you pronounce. I don't think there's particularly any notations, but there are a number of poetic sort of forms that allow to know, you know, when this was pronounced or when this was not pronounced, notably for the fact of the pronunciation of all the syllables, the ending of the E's. There's a knowledge of the spoken English and the various reasons, whether the A was an R or, you know. I don't know all the intricacies of that. And in order to perhaps not engage with all the intricacies, because it is its own complete sort of philological knowledge, I did take the shortcut and simply said, well, the whole aspect of this, I recognize, from reading it, I recognize aspect of my contemporary Norwegian. And knowing about Viking trips to the Isles many centuries ago, I sort of just start using that quite freely. So there's no sense here that I make a claim that this was the right pronunciation. That's why I also mention it, if you like. So, yeah.
It's really interesting to hear it done like that, because
Yeah.
if I've ever worked on it, we always anglicise it and make it, you know, understandable for us, but actually it was equally understandable and almost made more sense.
Yeah.
You know, it was unnerving.
It is unnerving also. With Middle English, there is, I mean, it is really, because it's got sort of already cut itself off, the very much more complex syntax of Old English. It's sort of an English that we are starting to be able to recognize, and the spellings of it that get sort of not standardized, but that start to get really put down by Caxton when he prints Chaucer, and even Chaucer in his sort of sense of wanting to really take one aspect of the English, of his English language at that point. It's sort of fascinating how modern, I mean, you still have to struggle. It still is a language in translation when you read it today, but it is so much closer than if you read, you know, just, sorry.
No, as a footnote, it is, however, extremely interesting now, if I remember, in Germany, learning English in university. In the first semester, we were required to take Old English and Middle English. And I'm not sure how it is in Norway or in China or in Greece. Learning a foreign literature, you first of all also have to do linguistics. Isn't that interesting?
That's right. That you go with the most difficult aspects of that language. You don't go to the literary aspect. That's considered too difficult. So you go to the Old English syntax. So I had Old French. So you go to Old French. But it's sort of, it's done, it's grammar. It's not the text. So yes, it is peculiar because we reinforce that it is dead, and yet you just pull it out of itself and you bring it out in performance or whatever, or in and you see that you can still feel that part of that journey. You know. And that's what I found so interesting, is really to try and explore that journey, an aspect of that journey through my own work as a writer, and then to think about contemporary English and the journeys that is happening with it now, you know, as a continuous sort of transformation. So.
And again, as a footnote, when you talk about borders and border crossing with the maps, I remember learning then that at a certain important point in the 18th century there was a große Lautverschiebung, some very big change in the language, how it shifted from middle to modern, and this affected many European languages, so that you can see how also the language drifts across the continent.
Of course, yeah, and of course trade and everything will also emphasize that, politics and occupation and etc. So yeah.
And actually, for me, Middle English is somehow familiar because this was before the next wave of French and Latin influence, which came after Middle English and created modern English, and Scottish had fewer Latin influences than English did because it was further away.
Right.
And it did the Romans didn't get quite as far up there. So in fact, some of our pronunciations are much more like that.
Yeah, exactly, yeah.
I found it was a very poetic and very potent sort of presentation of language, but I also felt that the language is used to sort of interrogate itself. So you both sort of expose the problematics of language, but as a process it begins to interrogate itself. So it's not about language speaking of the world, but rather language speaking and interrogating itself. Is that an observation that is relevant to your approach? Or?
Certainly it's one aspect of it, and I think that as a writer one does interrogate, I mean, or let's say that in relation to the way I consider my role as a writer, to interrogate language is one of the things that I do and that I consider important to do. So the fact that language is also seen in a sort of folding and unfolding with itself seems to me important. So for example, the trilingual piece, the last trilingual piece, which is a sort of semi-translation into Norwegian and French with alliterative assimilations between English and Norwegian through the sounds, all that I find interesting. The fact that these languages are close historically and they are close politically is also of interest. I chose languages that share a deep sort of roots, a deep historical root. So yeah, I think that would be, for me, I would take that on as a compliment that that work is happening. Then there is the sense of talking about the world where language is the world, language is in the world, language does, you know, shape the way we see the world. So when I then engage with narratives, or when I think about the shibboleth or whatever, then I then take on, I suppose, different kinds of methods that I would find interesting without claiming to represent the world, but a slice of it as seen by my exploration. So with the Say Parsley, it was very much to do with perception and how we mishear, or how sounds become impossible sounds to pronounce and what that does to you and things like that. And that also is the world in the sense that it's the spoken or the speaking body that finds itself faced with that. So,
do you see language as a kind of a priori space of negotiation and interrogation, or do you still see, is it the body that's speaking, or the language as such, which is a sort of cultural...
Yeah. Well, this whole idea of a language as a sort of closed, finished system is not something that I can advocate in practice. It's something that we are taught in relation to a particular kind of linguistics. Absolutely, language is a system, but the way the speaker and the speakers reshape it seems to me really crucial. That same idea around speech, discourse, and language as system. But the notion of a priori, that seems to me really crucial. There is an aspect whereby we come to language and we learn it. So we are taught language. Therefore, there's an aspect of a prioriness that becomes us, that becomes me as a speaker of this and that language with these sort of given values that are occupied in that language. And that's really important, because then when one wants to then start examining language as a writer, as a performer, as a whatever, where language becomes a sort of important tissue, then you are faced with everything that language is also doing to you, is doing to your environment, and how do you invest, how do you reinvest, how you disinvest. So yeah, I think there is an a priori because we learn language. So it's not as if you could say you have the body and you have language over there. You have pre-linguistic modes that come and interrupt language, and you have post-linguistic modes that come and sort of confirm a broader reality than a verbal reality and then a linguistic one. But there is a centrality of the linguistic or the speaking being of the linguistic being, it seems to me. Yeah, that's definitely the way I consider it. So we're both prisoners of it, and we also are being made agents in the world because of it. So.
Alison,
I'm just really interested in how you collaborated with your sound design, because clearly, there's that wonderful relationship between the materiality of the words and the focus on the language and the linguistic play that's going on, but that's highlighted and maybe more evocative by sound design. I'm just a little bit interested in how you worked on that.
Yeah. Yeah. You're referring mainly, I suppose, to the last piece.
Yeah.
But he also, Adam Parkinson, he also designed the sound for the piece, the trilingual piece, inside the Little Red Room. Wow. So that you have a sense of a slight quadraphonic at times sense, because we had, 4 speakers for that one, and we were circulating the sound across the space. And he worked sort of quite specifically at citing those 2 pieces, One DJ Too Many and Crop, in relation to creating obstacles to the verbal language that had been recorded, so the text themselves, and allowing for a circulation of his sounds and the sound of the voice and the language in the space itself, notably with the wires. So there's a sense of assimilation of the wire structure through the way he sort of really plays that sort of really sort of radio tone, this white noise. And in Crop, it's actually much more of a sense of slight destabilization, where you can hear the sentences you think, perhaps even here today I thought, oh my God, you think sometimes it's broken or whatever. So there's also that sense of playing with sort of fairly high quality sound recording and sound mixing, and then breaking it down. Yeah, so that's very much the way he was thinking it and did it. I think extremely discreetly, again, very, very precise. And it becomes very visceral, like you don't know if the wire is language or no, whether the language is the verbal or the wire, or there's moments where he managed to really infiltrate. And then when you are in the space, you just had these wires around that were sort of creating its own frontier, its own barrier. So the text that you see displayed is a type of vinyl lettering which is reflective. So again, it moves according to where you stand in the space. Very simple optical illusion and game of reflection with the outdoor light, but very efficient again, because you can't hear everything and you can't see everything, So.
I was interested idea of kind of the borders. We're kind of familiar with how language operates in that way, but also kind of our own borders. I wondered as well if you've done any work on it, not just borders, but the gatekeeping that language can be. And I suppose I was thinking about accent, and I was thinking about Middle English. I mean, I don't know anything apart from, you know, schoolgirl Chaucer about Middle English, and I was wondering that, you know, if that was the language that was spoken, you know, on the road to Canterbury or wherever, and what was happening in the court, for instance, and probably they were all speaking French, I don't know. But that, I wondered if I was kind of interested if you've done your work in that, but also what you're working on now and where you're kind of going now.
Yeah. I'm glad actually that you mentioned the word gatekeeping, because in my descriptions of Say Parsley we use this idea of speech as gatekeeper. So very much the sense of the boundary set, and if you can pronounce it, then you are sort of straight through, and if you can't, then that's it. You're kind of completely done for. And so this whole idea of accent, and for a while I used the idea of accented practice as a way of trying to understand what was interesting to me. So these are the things that sort of start putting things in relief, so that you have a sense of notions of acquired standardizations, and then you start thinking, well, what about this and what about that? And it immediately opens a can of worms, and then navigating through that and really finding myself very interested in that. So that's the term, and that's the notion that I've used. I think that the notion of accent, accented, you know, you can open that up, you know, to include so many other aspects, so many other narratives. So I sort of hold to those sort of nearly rarefied narratives that I tell. You have the Say Parsley massacre that I tell through a sort of very, through nearly a perceptual issue here with the fig, and which is about pronunciation. And I do that because that confusion is so small, and it's so, and yet it's there. And it's also, some of it can be quite comical, and at the same time, because of the context in which I place that particular list, you know that there's other things at stake. So, you know, sometimes just very schematically showing something and accepting that very schematic nature of work can sometimes just sort of hit that nerve. So that has been very, and continues to be important to me, those perceptual issues to do with language awareness, inscriptive awareness. What I'm doing now is, well, I'm just starting new projects at the moment, so it's a little bit difficult to say what I do now, because now I don't know. But I have been doing a silent film, which is primarily made of graphic pieces that are all language related, and that play very much on, again, on notions of reading, not being able to read, not being able to see everything, not being able to, you know. So again, this is really just a visual which becomes a disturbance rather than the sonic and the oral, which I've been working on. So now really trying to create that disturbance visually. So that's a piece of work that I've already shown, but I'm taking it apart at the moment because I was interested in the ideas and I'm pursuing them. So one piece is called The Grey Variation. It's literally just greys and then language in between trying to come through in disappearance. And it's all about, you know, the absolute of difference. You know, so there's this paradox and the irony of that. And then I'm presenting a piece at Counterpoint, this festival that I was talking about this afternoon to some of you who are here, which is, I think, a wonderful festival that was started by the Refugee Council. And it is to do with thinking about form and content and narrative of exile, narratives of refugees, but again outside of sort of established sort of exile narratives. So it's always the difficulty of identity-based or identity-enforced arts. And so Almir Kolzik, who is the organizer of this festival, his take is exactly that. How do we bring aesthetics and how do we bring artistic involvement, artistic questions to those political identifiers? You know, so again, to open that up and to really look at it from other perspectives. So that's at the LADA, Live Art Development Agency, at the end of November. And I'm showing a piece of work there that I showed in Leeds in the summer, and it's a short video and it's a document of that piece. So.
Send us something else.
Yeah, great. Yeah, I will. I'll send the information. Yeah.
I actually wanted to ask you about the what you call the Red Room, because I felt when I was watching that I was looking. It felt to me physically very different. To I wanted to be there. I know that the other piece in the gallery with the wires was spatial. That it would have been different had I been there, and I would have felt something. But because it was visual, I felt that I got some of what that was. But the red room felt that the language was kind of the only thing happening, and that would affect my body in a very specific way.
Yeah.
So I was.
Yeah, that's very true. I sort of hated that room initially. I thought it was extremely claustrophobic and very dense in that red. So I was reacting in a very sensory way to that, or through the senses to the red. I was finding it really difficult, and so we sort of pursued that because that sort of felt quite interesting, since the text that is placed across the room is very much has to do with, again, there's notion of violence and abandonment and things like that, also through language, and but again this idea of border crossing, and actually it was the room that managed to just do its own work because of that. So I'm actually pleased that even in a document you can see what it was trying to do. That, you know, the fact that I really didn't like that room actually, but sticking to it and us just working it through with Adam for the sound, and just putting that quote by Glissant in a very, very dark color. So many people only saw the quote as they were leaving the room, and you could, you know, had to backtrack to see that quote. All that I found very interesting. It became a very sort of nearly sort of intimate, sort of dark and intimate, nearly sort of enforced secrets type of room as well. But people would stay quite a long time in it. So it sort of carried both a sense of the safety of that depth and color, and at the same time the destabilization and the motifs were sort of keeping people in. It was it has now remained as a more interesting room, the fact that I felt such repulsion for it as well. So
very performative.
Very much so, yeah.
The spectator who's feeling it.
Yeah. It is slightly more immersive than the rest, where you are, with the rest, you're slightly more seeing and hearing, whereas there, you actually, and even in that room, you actually didn't know, and you didn't know if it was the red or what it was that was sort of keeping you there, so, or throwing you out. So.
This would be a fascinating object of study for the neuroscientists, because I think the way color might affect the processing of language.
Absolutely.
Or sound in different parts of our brain is something that they're examining these days. And I remember seeing an announcement of a show by Carlos Cruz Diaz, which was all about different color rooms, and he's a visual artist. So you mentioned Robert Smithson, which excited me, and I think of him as a sculptor, although he's written a lot on his work.
Yeah, I agree, I feel the same, yeah.
The work in Mexico, or when he began to do his land art pieces, how does sculpture inspire you, looking at the wonderful installation you just had?
Yeah, perhaps as mass and movement rather than as objects. So that perhaps also explains my interest in Smithson or Matta Clark, where, you know, where it's not even monumental. It enters into a completely different dimension of reintegration of those rethought environments into a broader environment, which I find very, so they move nearly into architecture, and of course his idea of land art is a sense of having it integrated to the sort of slow changes of the landscape. And I find all that really fascinating. But otherwise, the idea of object in sculpture, I would perhaps relate to that, to this notion of the object in, you know, some objects in language, so some language detail, like the way I was talking about some of these phonemes, and then looking at some sculptural element, as, you know, I'm thinking about Fred Sandbach at the moment, you know, just his very thin lines are just redefining everything, the object of the line, rethinking the whole space. And yet you still have an object, but that object is sort of imploded into the space, and forces you as the viewer to sort of I don't know, you become tentative in that space. And I find, or Sarah's sort of monumental sort of impositions, I think all that's really fascinating, less as object and nearly more as sort of events, mass events, if you like. And they can be very discrete, but they are sort of transforming one's environment through nearly making that invisible somehow. Find that fascinating.
I was totally intrigued, and also many associations come to my mind when I was seeing the tensile in architecture. I think when they build bridges, remember the
absolutely.
When they're doing the engineering, they have to measure all of the tension, so to see the stretched lines.
Absolutely.
Not thinking of them as lines in language.
Yeah, those lines interested me as well, because I was working with a duo of architects to set up this grid. It was quite a big thing to to set up, again, the calculations and everything. But there's a little bit of an anecdote with it, because we started with screws that were like that, more or less. And so we start setting up those things. And the gallery team, they're intensely familiar with airspace and with ideas of tension, and they're sort of going, I just don't know if it's going to hold. And then you can see one wire started going. And then we sort of went a little bit bigger and a little bit, and we ended up with things like that. And they had to drill further down to it was fascinating, the amount of tension that you have over those 15 meters that took place. And you could say that, of course, that's logical. But for me, never having worked with architects or architecturally, I was really excited by the effort and the force needed to hold something just like this, just hanging over ground. It's fascinating. Fascinating, yeah.
Having lived in Japan for about 19 years, I had to sort of, in a sense, rethink the way language is constructed and the way language is spoken, and contextualise idea and what's important is unsaid often as much as what is said.
Yeah.
Have you sort of examined sort of pictorial sort of origins of Chinese calligraphy or that kind of realm of language and production of meaning? I mean, I know you can't encompass everything in your work, but it seems to me a counterpoint to the sort of
That's true.
more literal
Yes.
alphabetic sort of language that we speak.
Yeah, that's a very interesting comment. I always accompany my work with drawings that are extremely unskillful, but that are literally there as sort of just pauses in relation to this overall very articulate work that I'm sort of interested in shaping, in which I also figure ideas of erasure and silencing, etc., but where the notion of silence itself might not necessarily always be made manifest. So the notion of drawing as a sort of physical presencing of the act of writing, or as all that I find actually very interesting, and I often resort to these drawings or to whatever, even like Michaud, left-handed drawings or whatever, as a way of prepping or sketching or thinking about projects. But I wouldn't. There's no training or skill in the way that one would have from Islamic calligraphy or Chinese calligraphy or Japanese calligraphy, which I find absolutely extraordinary, but which I don't even begin to wish to emulate, because that would really be another life, with the intensity of practice that demands. But I find the gestural aspect of writing, of inscription, very interesting. So even at the extremely base, crude level of ink and pen and the roughness of paper or the scratching of whatever, that's something that I have as one sort of less developed but present imaginary in my production. But I'm really pleased that you mention it as something, because it's definitely, it really creates a pause as well for me. So.
Mentioned about Chinese calligraphy, I found very interesting. European language almost similar to because Chinese is very different. So if I do a project, I wouldn't find a lot of similarities between like dance or you have the vocabulary. So I think it's very similar.
Yeah, but you're right. I mean,
even they goes after, they goes letters.
Yep.
Chinese you have after, but then you have characters.
yeah.
So it's interesting to see the Western culture, how we collaborate this language.
Well, it's
They really have
sorry.
to do this, our language.
Well, your writing system is based on writing, whereas you could say the alphabetic system is based on sound systems. So it's a reproduction of sound. So from that point of view, and on top of that, I'm choosing languages that share a very, very strong political history of endless traffic and endless sort of military and trade and cultural exchange. So there's definitely, I can completely see that you're thinking, well, they're the same. In a way, they share exactly the same alphabet. In Norwegian, you have 3 extra letters. That's about it. But you can still see that makes, a difference. You have diacritical marks in French, which you don't have in English. You have minute sort of little, differences. But I think your point is very right, is very correct, to see that actually they're closer than they are different. But, we are very used to keeping...
I performing arts, how you use space, language, and the sound. So
Thank you.
I really enjoyed that.
Yeah.
And I agree, Fiona mentioned like red room.
Mm.
It's more, it means to be more immersive.
Yeah. Yeah, that's great.
It's too style.
Yeah.
You mentioned earlier about language is not written, it's viewed. Can you explain?
Sorry, I didn't hear that. I didn't.
You mentioned earlier, you said the language is not written, it's viewed. So,
The Smithson quote.
Oh, yeah, yeah, no, that's right. Yeah, yeah, here we go. There's always the joy of misquoting, but I think I have it here. He says something that it's built, not made. It's built, not, no, that's not. It's built, not, well, it's,
language is not written, it's viewed.
yeah, that's right, something like that, yeah, yeah. It's in the, well, it's in one of the essays in collected writing. You want me to comment on that?
Oh, I just wonder, is that because the architecture inspired you a lot of comments? I thought that you have to explain a bit more, but
Yeah, well, I mean, I use his pyramid of the heaps of language just as a very schematic sort of way in to this idea of space and thinking about inscription in relation to it constructing space as well. It's not something that I do in this book particularly, but I have used the book as a sort of metaphor for a travel in space, and that reading is also a travel in space from particular directions, and that you can confuse those directions. So I've been very interested in that. The interest in architecture is actually, I would say, nearly indirect, because it's that when you enter a site, it presents itself with, you know, its sightness, basically, and you have to look at it, accept it, and see what you can do with it, with the elements that you're interested in and the reasons why you are there. So it's not architecture from the point of view of that particular discipline necessarily, but it's the knowledge of the built environment, or, you know, that you're entering in, and what it will, what it might do to you and to your practice. And that reminds me of a project of Fiona's that I have written about that I find really extraordinary from that point of view, called Cells of Release, that some of you, you're nodding no. Well, that same thing of accepting a site. You go onto a site for a specific reason, you accept its conditions, and these conditions are not the ones you thought they necessarily were. I'm speaking for you, but I'm sort of remembering some of the things that were preoccupying you. Suddenly you find yourself being a very different type of writer, having a very different mind, and sort of having to allow the site to do its work on you. And that will be part in creating the work. And then you have all the posters, the markers of it, like, for example, the Prisoners of Conscience, the collaboration with Amnesty, that set up other boundaries, other points, you know, that you remember. That is the extent of my sort of understanding of the architectural in relation to my work. Yeah, so the built environment, you know, as a point of sociality in relation to writing and inscription. So.
Yeah, one of the things that
Thank
I
you.
think you see even in the text of that piece that I was thinking about is that our word writing is from Old English retan, which means to scratch, and which I was very aware of working in this old prison, because it felt like something where humans had been kind of scratching at the walls, and that even without language there was still inscription, which interested me.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
And our word poetry is from the Greek meaning to make a heap.
Well, there you have it, yeah.
Any last comments, critiques?
Well, thank you very much.
Well, thank you. Thank you. Yeah.
It's funny, it's quite different. Either it was quite different or I picked up on different
No,
things.
it was different.
Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
because of the
Yeah.
pedagogical situation, I
Yeah.
introduced more things, and
Yeah,
I couldn't
yeah.
just take that they would be interested in the literary because of the performing.
Yeah.
So I brought in other elements. Yeah. But well, they were attentive. I have removed the sound. So why is this? Perhaps Johannes needs to remove the sound. He said, well, the whole aspect of this, I recognize, from reading it, I recognize aspect of my contemporary Norwegian. and knowing about Viking trips to the Isles many centuries ago, I sort of just start using that quite freely. So there's no sense here that I make a claim that this was the right pronunciation. That's why I also mention it, if you like. So, yeah.
It's really interesting to hear it done like that, because
Yeah.
if I've ever worked on it, we always anglicise it and make it, understandable for us, but actually it was equally understandable and almost made more sense.
Yeah.
It was unnerving.
It is unnerving also. With Middle English there is, I mean, it is really, because it's got sort of already cut itself off, the very much more complex syntax of Old English. It's sort of an English that we are starting to be able to recognize, and the spellings of it that get sort of not standardized, but that start to get really put down by Caxton when he prints Chaucer, and even Chaucer in his sort of sense of wanting to really take one aspect of the English, of his English language at that point. It's sort of fascinating how modern, I mean, you still have to struggle. It still is a language in translation when you read it today, but it is so much closer than if you read, just, sorry.
No, as a footnote, it is, however, extremely interesting. I'll try and bring up some more lights.
Does anyone have something to ask Caroline or comment? No?
Yeah.
Chaucer language.
Mm-hmm.
If it was influenced by the Scandinavian, which is pretty good, it was, coming across, but how much knowledge do we actually have that that's how it was pronounced?
Oh,
Or is it your interpretation?
yes, it really is my interpretation. I've been speaking to a medievalist who's very interested in this performance of basically a dead language, and how do you know and how do you pronounce. I don't think there's particularly any notations, but there are a number of poetic sort of forms that allow to know, when this was pronounced or when this was not pronounced, notably for the fact of the pronunciation of all the syllables, the ending of the E's. There's a knowledge of the spoken English and the various reasons, whether the A was an R or, I don't know all the intricacies of that. And in order to perhaps not engage with all the intricacies, because it is its own complete sort of philological knowledge, I did take the shortcut and simply... I want some sugar in my roll. Kiss the smooth, shiny, shiny leather, shiny leather, the dye. I'm not a woman. I'm not a man. I'm something you can't comprehend. I'm a threshold yearning to sing. You can feel it in the air. Breathe to the rhythm. Dance to the rhythm. Work the rhythm. Live to the rhythm. Love to the rhythm. Like the surge of the wave, lead the naked island. Oh yes, I love you. Me either. Subtitle Why Madeleine, because I was thinking about the Proustian sensory jolt, the way when he eats that little Madeleine, if he remembers.
Now, if I remember, in Germany, learning English in university, in the first semester we were required to take Old English and Middle English, and I'm not sure how it is in Norway or in China or in Greece. Learning a foreign literature, you first of all also have to do linguistics. Isn't that interesting?
That's right. That you go with the most difficult aspects of that language. You don't go to the literary aspect. That's considered too difficult. So you go to the Old English syntax. So I had Old French. So you go to Old French. But it's sort of, it's done, it's grammar. It's not the text. So yes, it is peculiar because we reinforce that it is dead, and yet you just pull it out of itself and you bring it out in performance or whatever, or in and you see that you can still feel that part of that journey, And that's what I found so interesting is really to try and explore that journey, an aspect of that journey through my own work as a writer, and then to think about contemporary English and the journeys that is happening with it now, you know, as a continuous sort of transformation. So.
And again, as a footnote, when you talk about borders and border crossing with the maps, I remember learning then that at a certain important point in the 15th century there was a große Lautverschiebung.
As his childhood, and the same thing that whenever we come into a shop or a car, and then suddenly you hear a song, it often draws you back to all sorts of things. Okay, and then you just have the names. So I let the credits go up just for the fact that this piece was created with about, well, 4 or 5 collaborators, and then the gallery team setting up this. So it was quite an extensive, a lot of people worked on facilitating this this project, and then of course the documentation for the video. I think that's what I have to, what I came with to talk to you about. So I just wanted to thank Johannes and Fiona for having invited me to come and talk to you today. So I hope you found it interesting. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Sometimes I sit here to moderate. Fiona, why don't you join your guest, and then you can moderate a little bit the discussion? Yeah.